everyone. Today I'd like to share with you a conversation I had with my friend from college, Lin Yang. He has a wealth of experience in journalism as well as communications. If you'd ever been interested in what journalists or communications professionals do, this is the interview for you. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. It's good to see you again, Lin.
Yes, Jen. Great to see you again too.
So, Lynn, can you tell me a little bit about how you grew up? Like, I know you grew up in Seattle, right? Or you born in Seattle?
Yeah, I grew up all over the place. Uh,
Okay. Hmm.
I, I, my parents and I moved around a lot. I think I once counted that I moved like maybe 13 times from
Wow.
when I was born to when I graduated from college, right?
Oh, wow, that's a
And
lot more than me, and I thought I moved around a lot.
Yeah, I grew up mostly, well, I was born in China, but I came to the United States when I was 4 years old. And I actually grew up in upstate New York. I grew up in Syracuse.
Really?
My parents
Oh,
went to
wow.
Syracuse University. They were grad students there.
I did not
Um,
know that.
yeah, and then my father was one of the first students to leave China on a government-sponsored scholarship to study in the United States after the Cultural Revolution.
I see.
And when he came to the United States. My mom came a couple of years later, and then I followed them a couple of years later. And so they ended up in Syracuse. I spent part of my elementary school in Syracuse, and then when my dad finished his PhD, we moved to Singapore.
Oh,
And so I lived in Singapore for about 2 years. But during that period, my mom stayed in Syracuse to finish up her master's, and so I bounced around between the US and Singapore.
wow.
And then I came back to live with my mom for an extended period of time when she finished her degree. And then we moved to outside of Ithaca, Tompkins County, actually.
Oh,
We lived
really?
right in New York. My parents had their first job working for a small tech company that was located in Dryden. It had like maybe 10 employees. And I lived there until probably middle school, and then moved down to North Carolina, lived there really briefly, and then my parents got divorced, and then my mom moved to Seattle and brought me with her. So I ended up moving to Seattle in eighth grade and graduated high school in Seattle.
Wow, that's quite an adventure. Do you have
Yeah.
any memorable moments? Like, do you feel like, and I moved around, not quite as much as you, but I moved around a little bit as well. And I feel like that helped shape me, like, to who I am. And I feel like I'm more accepting of new people and different cultures, or it helps me, like, be able to adapt to different situations. Do you feel like you're moving sort of like, did you learn different things from different places, or was there like, do you have a place that you feel like you call your hometown?
Yeah, so the political world, your hometown is where you graduate from high school.
Mm.
And so the Seattle area, or specifically this town called Sammamish, Washington, is my hometown, right? That's my technical definition of a hometown. Um, but to answer your broader question, yes, the answer is yes. In fact, I went back to Cornell, I went back to upstate New York, went to Cornell, old haunts in my view, from my past life. And then I kept moving. I kept moving everywhere. It's been a while, but I think Jen, you've mostly stayed in New York, right?
Yeah,
Since
wait,
graduating.
I thought I would move more, but I didn't.
You didn't, right?
No.
No, I went everywhere. I graduated. I moved down to the Mississippi Delta, and I taught high school for 2 years as part of Teach for America. And then I moved to Boston and got my master's in public policy from Harvard. And then I stayed in Boston for an extra year, and then I moved to Singapore to become a journalist.
Oh, wow.
And then I moved to Taiwan and continued my journalism career as a foreign correspondent based out of Taipei. And then I moved back to the US, but then in LA and got my MBA. And then I moved to the Bay Area to work for Adobe for 4 years. And then I finally moved back to Seattle, and now I'm at
Like a whole
Microsoft. So
circle back.
yeah, and so like it was like repeating my childhood as an adult and experiencing. But what was really interesting is that it's also experiencing the different places I've lived in as an adult, which is very different than experiencing as a child, and it gives you a whole new perspective on some of these places that are permanently part of your identity.
Wow, yeah, I remember like some of the places that I see as a kid, I'm like, I thought it was so big and grand, and then when I go back, it's like this little place.
Right, right, yeah, and a lot of times these places have changed tremendously. Like Singapore has changed tremendously since I when I lived there in the early '90s.
Yeah, wow. And I want to hear more about Teach for America, because I'm very interested in education as well. How was that experience? Was it very difficult? Because I know some people say that it's a very, very tough job.
Yeah. It is, and for most people who go to Teach for America, it's always somewhat of a shock of what they end up getting themselves into, but they power through it, right? So TFA is a great program, right? It's the mission is incredibly inspirational. It's trying to recruit the best and the brightest in the country to spend 2 years in service to teach in an under-resourced school in different communities. And these are communities that are inner city communities in big cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and then also a lot of rural communities. And I ended up becoming a high school math teacher in the rural South. I was in the Mississippi a region called the Mississippi Delta, which is the areas between Memphis, roughly between Memphis and Vicksburg, along the Mississippi River, straddling the states of Arkansas and Mississippi. Right. And it's an incredibly rural area. It's an area with a lot of soul, a lot of history. It was the birthplace of the blues, and also the area that saw some of the worst violence during the civil rights movement. So, for a lot of us who went down there, we knew what our mission was, which is to go into this historical area and tackle the civil rights issue of our day, which is education inequality.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so we all went there, but the reality is, we are all idealistic students who didn't grow up in these places,
Hmm.
and we get 5 weeks of training
Wow.
before being thrown into a classroom and trying to adapt. And it's a challenge. My first year was an incredible challenge. My school was so under resources that I was teaching 4 math subjects in my first year. And
Oh,
so if
wow.
you think about it, I was creating 4 lesson plans every night
Wow.
for the next day, right? And it was very, very tough. I worked like investment banking hours for teacher pay, and I had definitely behavior and discipline issues in my class during my first year, and as a fresh teacher, sometimes when a student acts out or behaves in a way that challenges you in the classroom, you're not experienced enough to react in the right way to de-escalate it,
Mm.
right? And so I've definitely had experiences with somewhat scary student confrontations. The worst thing that happened in my classroom in my first year is I had a fire, like a kid lit something in my back of my classroom
Oh,
on
no.
fire. Yeah, and all the kids evacuated, the fire alarm went off, and
Wow.
the kids ended up spending the rest of the period in the library as I cleaned up whatever was burnt in my room. I know.
That sounds like a
But
nightmare.
yeah, but after the first year, you have your lesson plans, the kids kind of know you,
Mhm.
there's a new crop of teachers who they can pick on, and you develop a groove, right? And so I created a really good relationship with some of my students. Some of them repeated because I was teaching 4 classes. They just moved up and stayed in my class essentially.
Nice. Mhm.
And some of the kids I worked with were absolutely brilliant. I remember very clearly there was this one student who was solving a geometric proof, had to learn about proofs,
Mhm.
and she solved it in a way that I did not teach. When
Mhm.
I walked by her, I told her, "Oh, you didn't do it the right way." And she
Ah.
looked. All she did was look at me and say confidently, "It's right, Mr. Yang." Right? And I was like, and then I looked closely. Thank you. That's my wife. And then I looked very closely, and she did. She solved it in a way that was completely different from what I taught, and it made
So
me
cool.
realize how smart she was, and how incredible that was. And she was one of my like smartest students. And being able to to see and help students who are that talented was what made it all worthwhile,
Mhm.
right? And so I ended up, doing pretty well in school. Our state average for the state geometry exam was 33% passing.
Wow.
Uh, I achieved 50% in my classroom.
Yay.
So we beat the state average, even though we're probably one of the most under-resourced schools in the state. So I was pretty happy about that.
That's awesome. Did it make you want to continue teaching? I mean, I know the program is only 2 years.
Yeah. I think a lot of people do stay in teaching. I think the statistic back when I was in Teach for America is a third of them continue on in a career on teaching. Um, that was never my goal because I wanted to. I was always interested in public policy, but I was a firm believer that you can't really understand policy until you understand the front line and
Mm,
what's going on,
yeah.
right? And so to me, it was very much a learning by doing process to figure out what was actually happening in the schools and what are actually the structural challenges that are keeping these students back. And I would say I learned a lot, right? The
Yeah.
first thing is resources. These schools don't have the latest equipment, don't have good computers, don't have labs. That's already an instant deduction, right, in terms of what these students can accomplish
Right.
in that environment. They had a lot of teacher turnover.
Mhm.
Um, you know, this school without Teach for America teachers would be an empty shell. 70% of the core subjects in the school where I was teaching was a Teach for America teacher teaching that core
Wow.
subject, right? So,
Mhm.
and TFA teachers leave every 2 to 3 years. So that
Right.
constant teacher turnover is a problem. Yet this is a rural area that just can't attract talent because nobody wants to live in a somewhat depressed economic region where there wasn't even a coffee shop in town,
Mm-hmm.
right? Definitely no movie theater, definitely no bookstore. There was a liquor store, but that was it, right? So, it's not the kind of place that can attract talent. And then I would have to say the final thing is like, a lot of in rural areas, the students aren't exposed to what their potential is, right? And so, I once went on a field trip where I took the students to a university in Memphis to see a Peace Prize winning speaker speak,
Oh,
and
cool.
that was really cool.
Hmm.
But we only took 10 students. Most of the other students don't know, or don't get exposed to that kind of stuff. One of the other things I did when I was there was I applied for a grant and I got like $2,000 and I set up a college advising program because our school didn't have one.
Wow.
I worked with about 15 students after school. They all signed up by choice
Mhm.
to help them apply for college and to go through the college application and essay writing process. And I paid all their application fees using my grant money.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Do you feel like some of those lessons that you took from that practical experience, did you apply that to your current job or your work as a journalist or your work even now?
Yeah, I've spoken about this in previous job interviews. For first of all, I was an education consultant for a year after my Harvard Master's in Public Policy degree.
Mhm.
And I would say it was directly applicable because some of the wider level district resourcing issues and talent issues are mirror images of the school resourcing and talent issues that are happening in districts across the country. So that was absolutely applicable to be able to kind of draw from that experience and come up with recommendations, for instance. And then the second part that's applicable is I always joke to people I talk to in job interviews that there's nothing more nerve-wracking than standing in front of a room full of teenagers trying to convince them to do something because it's important for them. And the amount of kind of skeptical looks you get and the potential for interruptions make you almost impervious to communicating in any other setting. And
That's probably
so
true.
I have never been nervous in giving presentations and speaking in front of a crowd, giving a speech, talking on recorded YouTube, because nothing is as nerve-wracking as trying to teach math in front of a room full of 30 kids.
I can understand that for sure. Awesome. So cool. So definitely, the folks who are watching this and they're considering doing Teach for America, definitely
Yep.
do it. I was considering that after college as well.
Yep.
Um, I did start a job, so that didn't work out for me, but still have that heart for education. So awesome.
Yep.
Let's move on a little bit and talk about your experience in Taiwan. So you were a journalist in Taiwan as well as Singapore, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a bit different. Is that so? I know your degree in Cornell was more public policy. Now, do you need to have a degree in journalism to go into journalism, or can you,
Absolutely not.
like, how you got into that, or
Anyone can be a journalist these
oh,
days
okay. Well, I guess I am now because I'm on YouTube.
if you can start a blog, yeah, or do a YouTube. um, yeah, the answer is no. I was all my friends and people I knew have always told me I was a good writer. And so when I was in Boston doing education consulting. It was right after the financial crisis, and it was a tough time to be in education consulting because you're basically going around telling districts who to fire, essentially, because
Oh
all
no.
districts were struggling.
Mhm.
And so I was looking for a career shift, and a friend of mine from the Kennedy School worked for a newspaper in Singapore, and so she passed on my resume, and someone who's in their late 20s with a Harvard degree wants to try out and start out in journalism. That seemed really attractive to her paper. And so, a few months later, I was on a one-way ticket to Singapore with an internship at a newspaper. It was the Straits Times, and a paid internship though. So I took it, moved to Singapore, and that's where I got my training, right? But basically, the Singapore newspaper assigned me to write Sunday features. And if you guys know what the Sunday features section is, it is basically the paper that somebody reads when they're sipping coffee on a Sunday morning. It has
Okay,
to be filled with really interesting kind of cultural, kind of wacky stories, right?
so not really like the breaking news kind of.
No,
Okay.
no, right? But some of these stories are really hard to research. I think two stories really stood out for me when I was there, and that really kind of solidified my training. The first one was investigating interesting neighborhood smells.
Huh.
We've heard tips that this neighborhood smells like chicken shit. Another one has wafts of candy and sweet flavor. Go discover what these interesting smells in these neighborhoods are and write a feature story about them. Like,
Interesting.
okay. I literally like bounced around town, like
Hmm. Like
sniffed air and then interviewed neighbors. That was
interesting.
right. And it was like there was one that it smelled like chicken shit because there was a chicken farm. There was another one because there was a chocolate factory. So that's
Oh,
why you get different
okay.
flavors depending on the
I
time
want
of
to live
day.
there. That's a good place.
Yeah, right. And so that was an interesting story. The second one was even more interesting. It was like about a guy who
Mhm.
worked for the telecom operator, and he embezzled a bunch of phones and sold them on the black market. He was caught,
Wow.
and in the kind of prosecutorial affidavit, they said that he spent the money on a luxury apartment, a Lamborghini, right, and $120,000 stingray, like a fish, a stingray.
Stingray?
Yeah,
Oh,
and my
wow.
assignment was to figure out why a stingray would cost $120,000.
Wow. Did you find
It was
out?
it was tough, right? I did, but I interviewed
That's an
everyone.
expensive fish.
Yeah, I talked to the zoo, I talked to the exotic fish dealers, and I
Mhm.
finally found one guy who explained to me that these are stingrays that have white spots on them. They're super rare.
Oh,
They were
okay.
exported from Brazil. They're freshwater stingray. They were exported from Brazil, and then there was this one year when Brazil, banned the export of this stingray, and so prices shot up on the international market for this rare fish, and it was about the time when this guy started on his buying spree. And
Like,
so
I can understand,
that's the
luxury
reason why.
apartment, luxury car, but Stingray? Like, really?
Yeah, the stingray. So
Okay.
the stingray it's a
That's on
brown
my
stingray
third
with
on my
white
wish
spots that
list, right?
glow. It's a brown stingray with white spots that glow in the dark if you put it under a
Oh,
black light.
yeah, that's pretty cool.
So it kind of has like a cool, like impressing girls kind of like a vibe to it, and I'm pretty sure that's why this guy bought
Okay,
the hundred
interesting.
and twenty
It's like
thousand
I'm gonna
dollars stingray
find
for
a
his rare
stingray
fish
just to
aquarium.
get girls.
Yeah, I know, I know. Yeah.
That's so fun.
So that was an
Up with
interesting
these
story.
ideas, or were these
But you know,
ideas given to you?
they're assigned to me. There
Oh,
are
okay.
some ideas that I pitched myself. For instance, I did a story on what migrant workers from China did for Chinese New Year's because they can't go home.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they get together with friends and make dumplings. That's every that's what all of them told me.
That's
Like
what we
the
do
person who was
here.
sweeping, yeah, exactly. The person who was sweeping the subway platform, the person who was working in a factory, all of them told me they do the same thing. They get together with their germer, right, their friends, and you know, quote unquote brothers, and make dumplings. Yeah, and then after Singapore, I just, you know, after my kind of time in Singapore ended and the internship ended, I moved to Taiwan. The reason I moved to Taiwan is because Singapore is still a relatively controlled press environment because the government is very cracks down on articles that and stories that does not look upon the government very favorably.
Oh,
But
interesting. I didn't know
Taiwan is a very, very free press
that.
environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a very, very, a really, really interesting place to see what a completely free press looks like in a Chinese speaking world. And
Mm.
so I started out working as a English copy editor for a local news agency there. And then I got my first foreign correspondent gig with the Deutsche Press, which is the German newswire, writing in English.
Mhm.
And then over the years, I gradually picked up more of these freelance gigs. And I eventually got a chance to write for this one you might know. Do you know IE Spectrum? It's like an
Oh yeah,
engineering
the IEEE. Yeah.
IEEE, yeah. I wrote for them. I wrote for South China Morning Post. I wrote for the New York Times. And there was a year when I actually did some TV work for the China's state television, CCTV
Oh,
International.
cool.
Yeah, so I was their English Taiwan guy for like a few months, and I
That's
did
awesome.
a bunch of stories on Taiwan, but they would never let me cover politics. So I did like festivals and, you know, earthquakes and things like that.
Yeah, more safe politically.
Exactly.
So how was living in Taiwan? I mean, my husband's Taiwanese. He was born in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm from mainland China, and our families are, always like it's a bit tense, and I wonder, um, for you, like your family is not Taiwanese, right?
No, we're Chinese.
So like being there, as like a non-Taiwanese Chinese person, like was there any experiences that was like, interesting or different? Like, did people like accept you, or did they feel like, oh, you're not Taiwanese, or like, did you feel anything like that?
Um, I would say the answer is no. Taiwan is such a small place, and it actually has a very, very strong international exposure
That's
because so many Taiwanese have grown up overseas,
that's true, right? Hmm.
right? A lot. And so because Taiwanese travel overseas, they've been doing it for decades, even longer than the Chinese have.
Right.
And so I feel like Taiwan is one of the most accepting places for foreign speaking people. In fact, Taiwan brings a lot of foreign speaking people to teach English in, you know, 补习班 and schools, private schools and private schools mostly throughout Taiwan. You know, and so I never saw that as a problem. I actually would recommend any Chinese person who is not controlled politically in some form or another to visit Taiwan,
Yeah.
especially during elections.
Ah,
And the reason I say that is because where else are you going to see the craziness of a free and fair election in the Chinese speaking world than
right.
in Taiwan? And there's things about elections that are uniquely Chinese and Taiwanese that don't happen anywhere else. For instance, Taiwan still has cars, little cars with blowhorns with the candidate's picture yelling slogans and playing Chinese music going down the street,
No
right?
way.
The Taiwanese, especially if you're a female candidate, heavily Photoshop their candidate photos on billboards.
Oh,
Heavily, heavily Photoshop. Um, their elections are super efficient. There's no mail-in balloting or anything like that, but there's almost no lines. Nobody waits more than half an hour to vote.
oh
And
wow.
every single vote is counted by hand, and the counting is recorded on camera at two different angles. so that you cannot cheat at all.
Okay, so
And
very open.
very open. And
Mhm.
usually within 20 minutes of the polls closing, you know who the winner is.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's
that's how
amazing.
fast they are at counting.
And it's a simple majority, right? They don't have this whole
Yeah.
electoral college thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. And
Mhm.
so it's incredibly efficient. They also have giant campaign rallies, where, people are waving flags and things like that. And their candidates sometimes stand on top of cars and wave and, talk and, do community engagement. Candidates sometimes randomly show up at weddings
Oh,
just to
really?
shake people's hands. Yeah. Like almost like they're the village chief, right? And even
And
if they're
it's a
not in,
small country, right? So it's just like,
yeah,
where can I go
yeah.
to get
Like
exposure?
it's I went to a wedding once where it's a candidate because he was wearing his little vest with his party, like symbol on it, and he just shows up and starts shaking people's hands, shaking like the bride and grooms.
Who
He was
invited
not a
this
guest. He
guy?
was not a guest, right? But he decided just to crash the wedding, and that's perfectly fine. People
That's
are
awesome.
are like, they don't feel like it's an intrusion. Like it's not a dirty thing for like the political leader to come pay their respects to your kid's wedding.
Very
So
different election culture.
I mean, incredibly different, and it was like really, really fascinating to watch, right? And to see what would an election look like, which is a very Western concept of
Mhm.
free and fair elections, like being actuated in the Chinese-speaking world, and there, it also creates the impression that you see of, hey, if China was not communist, or if the nationalists were not kicked out of China, what could have been
What would
at a
it look
national
like?
at a 1.4 billion scale. Like who would have known, right? It gives you
Yeah.
maybe a little bit of a taste of what an election in the Chinese speaking world could have been like.
Wow. And I know you mentioned the free press, right? And did you feel like um, being a reporter, being a journalist in a completely free press world, how did that compare to Singapore? Like, did you
Yeah.
feel like it was very a different experience that you were not as limited?
It was a very different experience. Let me give you an example. Taiwan isn't just a free press; they're really, really accommodating to foreign press because of the China-Taiwan political situation. They want to try to get as much foreign press coverage of of what they're doing as much as possible, right? And because China tries to snuff out Taiwan from almost any kind of international exposure, they're always trying to push back somehow. And so they treat foreign press really well. And A few examples is every year the president of Taiwan will have a national double ten is their national holiday,
Right.
uh, and uh, and they would have a party, and all the foreign journalists would get invited.
Ah,
Um, After Chinese New Year's, they would host another party for all the foreign journalists where we get invited to the presidential palace. And I had Ma Ying-jeou sing karaoke to me.
no way.
Yeah, I have a
That's
video of him singing
amazing.
karaoke to me.
To you personally?
well, to everyone, right?
Okay. I was
Yeah,
like, just,
yeah. It was
wow, that's
freaking and
awesome.
Ma Ying-jeou and his like chief of staff singing
Right.
karaoke as a duet. Um, and
Wow.
then, one year they had a military demonstration, and they flew us all in military transports to an offshore island where we got into a observation booth and saw them launch missiles, tanks, battleships, and little soldiers with bazookas and firing into the Taiwan Strait to simulate what they would do if the Chinese would invade.
Oh,
And then
they wanted
afterwards,
the foreign press to
yeah. And
report.
then afterwards, the president got up and gave a speech. So, they gave us a lot of access. And there was one year when I remember this very closely. I was the vice president of the Foreign Correspondence Club. And there was this one year when the government was going through some reorganization and they moved the management of relationships with foreign press from one agency to another. And then and then for some reason that didn't go so well and our relationship stopped. Like we couldn't get access to the government, we couldn't get anything, right?
Oh, wow.
And so we kind of complained. We sat down with them and complained. And the first thing they did was we worked together and created a networking event where every single government agency and their PR rep got in a room with all of our journalists where we passed around business cards and talked. Right. And so they were incredibly responsive to our needs. and they acknowledged that it was a blind spot and they missed it in the transfer, and they started back up, better press relations, um, taking us on these trips to see different things and so forth again after that. So I just thought they were very, very cooperative and helpful to media, which is the exact opposite of the Chinese government,
I
and
would
how
imagine, yeah.
and how journalists are in general treated, foreign journalists are treated in China, and how like you know you know disguised cops are following journalists around in China. So uh, you know the biggest shock is journalists who work in Taiwan who then get assigned in China, and it's like, oh my God. So
In for
from a
a treat.
friend to the enemy, right, of the state.
Wow, that's
So
so different.
yeah.
It makes me wonder too, like, are there foreign journalists in the US from other countries who report here?
Yeah, there are
I guess I
plenty.
don't never thought about that before.
Yeah, plenty. There are foreign journalists who are part of the White House press corps. There are foreign journalists covering, different aspects. Some, larger foreign press shops, like probably the BBC, would have different bureaus in the U.S., and The Economist would have different bureaus in the U.S. and journalists living in different places to cover different topics, like San Francisco for tech, the Midwest for kind of, farming, agriculture, and kind of automotive and industry, and then New York for finance, and then DC for politics, right? So, it's the same kind of relationship. Unfortunately, at least during the Trump administration, there was a lot of animosity between the US and China. And so every time China would restrict foreign journalists, the US would reciprocate against Chinese journalists in the U.S. And it was my view that that was not a great thing for the United States to do, because we're supposed to be the society of free press, and
Right,
so we don't want to follow down the Chinese down the rat hole of in the way that journalists are being treated in China.
right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can, just based on what you were saying in Taiwan, like my imagination would be that we don't have that here. I mean, probably, not as open access to everything like that.
I wouldn't say it's not as open access, but like, say if you're a White House correspondent, you get to sit on Air Force One. You get flown to places. That's part of the deal, right? So
Okay.
I would just say, yes, I think foreign journalists are treated quite well, but not shampooed to the level that the Taiwanese treat foreign journalists,
Right,
because
right. I think there's
uh,
different motive.
Taiwanese want any coverage,
Right. Like,
yeah,
please give us attention.
yeah.
Wow. So after that, then did you move to the Bay Area, right? Or
Yeah, I came I when I was in Taiwan, I covered the technology sector, because Taiwan is a huge part of the tech supply chain. So, companies like Foxconn, MediaTek, some of the laptop makers like Asus and Acer are all based there. And I got really fascinated in technology and in the high tech space. And so I came back to the US. I studied at UCLA. I got my MBA there, and I was really interested in going into tech, with my business degree. And so after UCLA, I ended up getting a job at Adobe,
hmm
and I moved up to the Bay Area and worked in Adobe for 4 years. I first did strategy work when I was at Adobe, and then I couldn't stay away from writing and journalism, so I ended up working in corporate communications at Adobe.
That's so cool. I feel like Adobe is one of the most respected companies, not only because of the the widespread use of its technologies, but also its investment in artists and creators. I attended one of, I think it was like their
Oh,
first
great.
virtual conference was a few months ago, and I was really impressed. I think it was a good mix of marketing their products, but also training and teaching.
Did you
Which
go to Adobe Max?
Yeah,
Was
yeah,
that
that was it. That was it. Yeah. I
yeah?
didn't do all of it because there was so much, but I picked and chose some really interesting sessions.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that because of COVID, that they basically open up the sessions for anyone that want to attend and make it
Mhm.
free.
Yeah, I love
Because
it.
the full Max experience when it was in Vegas was actually not cheap.
Mhm.
A
Right.
lot of, kind of people who do this for a living either pay it or have their companies pay, the conference fee to get that training. But now with COVID and the fact that you can't do that, they're making that technology so much more accessible to
Mhm.
everyone in the world, and it's allowing people to create and to make things even if they are stuck at home or can't be exposed. And it's just a great both a creative outlet and a mental health outlet for so many people.
Yeah, so awesome. So how was working there for you? Like, was it a different experience, like working inside a company that create helps people create? Was it as creative or fun working there as you would imagine? Or
Yeah, I mean, I would say Adobe has the culture of most tech companies, right? It's one where collaboration is key to success, and being able to drive both execution, right, of being able to manage a project from start to finish, work with different stakeholders to get that project from start to finish, and to show impact, right? And I had some great opportunities at Adobe. In my last year there, I was the chief of staff to the comms team and the VP of communications, and not only did I help her run the team, but I also was given the responsibility to run mergers and acquisitions communications, which
mm,
is a very, very tough operation to run because every time you communicate at an M&A, it's like you have to do the press release, you have to do the interview, you have to write the blog. There's multiple internal announcements, right?
mm,
You have to manage the employee sessions, announcing it. And there's like this entire cascade of announcements. And the key thing is none of that can leak before the announcement takes place. And
mm.
so everyone is doing this under a almost like a in a bubble, right? And in a closed environment, and nobody is allowed to talk about what they're working on with anyone else. Uh, and um, and being able to manage and run all those pieces, and then on the day that announce, I the press release goes out first, the blog goes out next, the announcements go out next, and you're like giving green lights to people to send out each of their communications. Like that I really enjoyed, is to be able to steer a pretty complex ship and to deliver something to the finish line. And it took weeks of work to coordinate everyone and lots of planning meetings, but to see that end result happen and to see the news coverage of that M&A that you worked on is pretty rewarding.
That's awesome. I think, before I went to college and even, probably a few years ago, I had no idea, what you would do as a communications person.
Yeah,
And I think I've learned much more about just how complicated it is and how subtle some of it is, because it's very easy to make a unintended mistake and confuse a lot of people.
yeah, no, definitely, definitely, and I'm sure you can appreciate that now that you are a public official as well.
So I have to be very careful of my words. It's like very, yeah,
Yeah,
it's a different way of thinking for sure. And
no,
then I think I read on your LinkedIn, like, did you work for Howard Schultz for his presidential run?
I did, and
Intended?
he was considering a presidential run for really briefly in 2019, and I was part of his team, which would have eventually turned into a campaign team if he had decided to run. And then that experience ended abruptly after Howard suffered an injury, a
Oh,
back injury. Yeah, when he was on one of his trips to, I believe he was in the state of Arizona visiting the border, and he had a little, unstable spill and hurt his back,
oh no.
and ended up getting like 3 back surgeries,
Oh wow.
and took a long time for him to recover, and that's when he decided to pull the plug because he was not in a physical shape to be able to run a presidential campaign.
Wow. That's very interesting. Unfortunately, he couldn't, continue. Hopefully he's feeling better from that, but
Yeah, yeah, but I did see, he's still very active and engaged. He was a big supporter of the Joe Biden campaign,
Mhm.
a major donor, coming from the state of Washington. He also has been doing a lot of work in terms of raising money and giving grants to restaurants, especially that are being
We're
hit,
really suffering.
we're really suffering through COVID-19 because of his, connection to, the restaurant and food service space. So it's obviously an area that he's very connected and passionate about. And he's not only become a source of funding and life support for a lot of these businesses, but he also is a huge advocate for getting, say, restaurant relief into stimulus packages that the federal government is considering.
That's awesome. So I also wanted to, pick your brain in terms of politics and your thoughts, because I
Sure.
know that, as an Asian American, and a lot of what I see is that there's not a lot of participation, both in voting and candidacy in the Asian American community, and also political giving, right? So I just want to kind of get your thoughts in terms of how can we motivate more Asian Americans to participate? And I think in our generation, maybe there's more, but the older generation, like our parents' generation, I feel like sometimes it's hard to motivate them.
Yeah. And I always go back to my experience in Taiwan, right? It's
Hmm.
not that Asian Americans don't want to participate in politics or Asians in general. In Taiwan, they have 70-80% voter participation rate in an election, right? And so uh, it's not like, I think the generalization that Asians don't want to participate in politics is just patently false. Asians across the world are super passionate about participating in politics, right?
Right.
I think the difference in the United States is that they are having trouble finding ways to participate in politics that speaks to them, and that's because the political infrastructure and the organizations that run the machines of our politics do not talk to Asian Americans and do not provide opportunities for Asian Americans to participate in any meaningful way, right? And so it's really unfortunate because Asian Americans are a huge untapped voting bloc in a lot of respects. It doesn't make sense um, for a lot of political campaigns to not reach out to Asian American communities and find ways for them to participate. I've read stories that Asian American votes made the difference in places like Georgia, for instance, when it flipped 2 Senate seats to Democrats, right? And so when Asian Americans are activated, they could mean the difference between winning and losing in some of these coastal, super diverse states like Texas, Georgia, potentially a few places in the Midwest as well that have, cities with sizable Asian American populations. The real question is what's in it for them. Uh, and I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think it's a little bit of parties, political parties actively recruiting Asian Americans and also providing things like clubs and money to start these advocacy organizations to organize in Asian American communities. Uh, but then the second half of it is that, like, you know, because we've been shut out of politics for so long, apathy has developed, and that needs to change, right? And I love the fact that you talk about political donations because I just want to make this very, very salient, right? Like after Joe Biden got elected president, the stock market went up like by a lot, right?
Hmm.
10 to 20%, right? Yeah, I'm sure a lot of wealth was generated, mostly because people was looking forward to better management of our resources in our government from the Biden administration, but two, because there was an expectation that more stimulus money was coming to help our economy, which is something that our economy desperately needs, right? That wealth generation was, depending on what your portfolio is, could have been in the line of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
In the grand scheme of things, donating $1,000 to the Biden campaign to help them win would have returned tens of $1,000s more, right, for you. And so the idea of not participating and not donating because you believe in a candidate and believe what they will do for your country and your economy, I think is a poor investment decision, right? And you would want to vote in the guy who has a plan for tackling COVID and getting us back to somewhat normal of a life versus the guy who pretends that COVID does not exist.
Right. I mean, I'm very passionate about politics, participation, voter registration,
Yeah,
donating. I feel like Asian Americans, among the people, I can't speak for everyone, but among the people that I know, in my community are more on the apathetic mode,
yeah,
or, they'll say like, oh, I support this person, but they may or may not necessarily donate. And then I think people also feel like, and this is the system, right? This is a United States system where you're not really buying votes, but money makes a huge
oh,
difference, right?
totally.
Like political donation is like the way to sort of even get your voice heard,
Yep,
because if you donate with a PAC, that's how you get you know more visibility, I guess, like
sure,
for your cause or for your group.
sure.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but I know
Yeah,
that
I mean,
we share the
yeah.
passion. So
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like the difference between someone who's competent in office and someone who isn't competent is going to cost you a lot more if you
right,
don't participate,
that's true. Yeah, I never thought
right?
about it that way.
Like it's going to cost you a lot more if you're the kind of person who just votes based on, your own prosperity, wealth, and checkbook. I would still argue that you need to vote and support the candidate who you think is going to create greater prosperity for everyone versus someone who's going to create more problems for society and make everyone poor. And and I can honestly say, between 2016 and 2020, during the Trump administration, almost everybody, was worse off.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Wow. That's awesome. So, I mean, not awesome that we're more poor, but I love that point. It's a really good point. So I want to sort of wrap up and just ask you, are there certain causes that you support now, like whether, nonprofit or projects that you're currently working on that you want more people to know about? Or I was going
yeah.
to, drop some links down in the description in case people are really like hear this and they get inspired to either help out or to give and contribute.
Yeah, so I've actually I ended up moving back to my hometown. We were talking about hometown, so Sammamish, Washington is my hometown. I graduated from high school here, and one thing when I came back and I discovered was, journalism is under really challenging times, and especially local journalism. And when I came back, I found out that our local newspaper closed
Oh,
2 years ago. And we actually just went through an election in Sammamish when without a newspaper, it was like misinformation festival. Um,
wow.
People lobbing accusations on Facebook, blogs reporting things with almost little or no factual basis to tear down candidates. It was a mess.
It's an epitome
It
of
was
fake
like
news, right?
it was like Trumpian politics at a local level. And so what ended up happening was after that election was over, and right before COVID started, I decided to start a local newspaper.
Wow.
Uh,
I think I saw that. I think I read
yeah,
about that.
yeah, and so we're called the Sammamish Independent, and I kind of knew that it was very hard to create a sustainable, financial, profitable model for a local newspaper just because of the digital age that we lived in, and
Mhm.
so I kind of turned the idea on its head. I created a nonprofit model where the people who contributed to our newspaper are volunteers, and my focus is on training the next generation of journalists and storytellers, particularly from our schools, so
I
high
see.
school students. And so what we did was we created a local newspaper staffed mainly by high school students who are writing about their town, and and as part of the program, they get training on how to become a storyteller and a journalist. And so what I do is on a monthly basis, I invite a real world journalist or someone who does training to do a workshop with these students. And so and this is tapping into my network. We've had, the China correspondent for the Washington Post talk to my students, an old friend of mine. We've had the director of diversity and inclusion and training for the Pointer Institute, which is the nonprofit that trains journalists in their careers, to talk to our students about the different programs that they have. Last week, we had a podcasting workshop from the local NPR station in Seattle. They
That's so cool.
came and taught the kids how to do storytelling via podcasting. And so, and all these kids are stuck at home because their schools are closed. So
Mhm.
we're giving the students an outlet to be able to tell the story of their community in
Mhm.
a time when people are so hungry for news because they're disconnected from everyone in the community. And so, yeah, our paper has been running for about 7 months now. We write about 10 articles a month, and we also have a podcast. And the students are fantastic. They are so amazing. They pick things up very, very quickly. We have a few great adult volunteers who serve as editors to help them do their research and figure out who to talk to
Mhm.
for their stories. But these students are driving the news coverage of our city and filling a huge gap that was missing in the last 2 years in our community.
That's so awesome. And I can totally see that coming full circle with your experience with teaching and
Yeah,
then combining that with
that's
journalism
right.
too. That's
That's
so
right.
cool.
Everything has a application later on in life.
Hmm. So what's your vision for that? Do you feel like, I mean, I think that's such an awesome idea. Do you think it's possible to have it in multiple locations in the US?
I think it is. In fact, based on kind of some of the connections I've made, it already is happening. And so there's another newspaper that I've been following called the Pelham Examiner. It's in Westchester County in New York State, and they're a newspaper that's run completely by students, much bigger staff than we are. They write something like 50 to 100 articles a month.
Wow.
And so a much more robust program. There's certain parts of the country in which the local newspapers have died. So the local university has stepped in and have college students cover the news in that town as well. And so people are trying to figure out different ways um, to provide that to fill the gap of information. And just at the end of the day, like, these towns and these cities that have lost newspapers are hungry for a source, just any source of information that does what typical journalist operations do, which is we ask questions, we fact check, and we interview people, right?
Mhm.
Those are the most basic things, but it's incredible how once you lose those three things, that almost not only politics, but the basic um, structure and norms of democracy start falling apart without those three things.
Yeah.
And so that's the gap that we're trying to fill, that many people in the country are trying to fill. And I've had a lot of people ask me for kind of my training materials and our mission and how we're structuring it. And I'm absolutely willing and open to provide and share those with anyone who's interested.
That's so awesome. Wow. Thank you so much for your time. I so
Yeah.
love talking with you and just learned so much within this short time. Do you have any
No
parting
problem.
words for us or for
Yeah.
parting words for maybe there's Jonah
Um,
for maybe young people or maybe older people who might be whether they're interested in politics, don't know how to start, or if they're interested in journalism, how
yeah.
do they
My
some pitfalls or what are some advice that you might give them?
my only advice is like like, we're all stuck at homes and COVID has been terrible, right? Let's not sugarcoat it. But like, I think now is the perfect time to find ways to give back to your community, especially if you're in the place to do so, in order to create that impact for a better future when we come out of this thing, and also just for your own simple, sane mental health, right? Get off the couch, stop watching and binging Netflix shows, and start doing something for your community's benefit, because we're all trying to build something better after we come out of this. And so that's what I encourage everyone to
Awesome. Thank you so much.
do.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this interview, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for more great videos coming up soon. Also, check out the links in the descriptions for the organizations that we talked about, including Teach for America as well as the Savannah Sugar Company. Go and support those nonprofit groups. Thank you and see you in the next video. Hi everyone. Today I'd like to share with you an interview. Okay. Hi everyone. Today I'd like to share with you a conversation I had with my friend from college, Lin Yang. He has a wealth of experience in journalism as well as communications. If you'd ever been interested in what journalists or communications professionals do, this is the interview for you. So without further ado, let's get to the interview.